Yeah, so I had quite a trip getting here. As you've heard, I took the 24-hour bus ride. Unfortunately, I wasn't in the Fox bus, which seemed like the Lady Gaga rock and roll bus. Instead, I was in an ordinary bus, which was actually quite nice. We had a lot of fun watching Tarantino movie and so forth. But it's been really amazing and remarkable that you've all made it here. I mean, we've never seen anything quite like this. I was saying, though, I think you've misunderstood what these things are for. You're supposed to be under them to protect you from the ash. But, well, anyhow. This is actually a gorgeous picture. One of the things that people don't really know about Wikipedia is that we do have a very large collection at Wikimedia Commons of really astonishing photography that people have donated to the project. This is our friendly volcano in Iceland. Actually, this photo is from about, I think it was from 2004, a little more peaceful back then and not disrupting all of Europe. But I looked that up this morning. I thought it was quite enjoyable. So just to get started here, this is a picture. Unfortunately, this is not a picture of me. I really wish it were. I have my mother tasked with finding a suitably similar dorky picture of me with a television back in the day. But it's meant to illustrate, when I was a child and we were watching television, I was the remote control. My father would say, "Son, change the channel," and I'd have to get up and go over and change the channel and come and sit back down. And at the time, we had 3 channels, 4 if the weather was right, but we only had 3 different channels that we could watch. And so the process of watching television and what you did with television was very, very simple. Later on, we had the VCR. My mother was a gadget freak, still is a gadget freak, so we had a very early Betamax. So now we had remote control. We were able to watch more different programs. And now I had a different job in the family. My mother would say, "Son, hook up the VCR." So I would have to go and hook up the VCR. Well, this is where we were in the 80s. Now, fast forward to today. This is when my daughter was born. She's 9 years old now. I got a TiVo, a digital video recorder. And this is one of the setup screens from the current TiVo. And just to give you an idea of how much more complicated life is today, you should just take a read of this. It says, "How do you want the TiVo DVR to obtain an IP address?" And you've got 2 lovely choices. You can get automatically from DHCP server, which is typical. Or let me specify a static IP address, right? Which do I choose? I have no idea what they're talking about. Fortunately, my daughter is now 9, and so she has a role in the house, which is, "Kira, please program the TiVo for me." So life goes in cycles. But the point of this is, as our technology for consuming television, and in fact, our technology for consuming all kinds of media, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, has become more sophisticated and become more complicated, culture itself is getting smarter. And this is something that a lot of people are surprised to hear, because it's very conventional to assume that the entire world's going downhill, people are getting dumber all the time. But in fact, if you step back and reflect on what has happened in our culture, this is not true at all. If we go back and look at TV comedies, for example, this is I Love Lucy, a great classic show, really funny, but very basic, very simple plots, very simple humor. Later on, we had Mary Tyler Moore, a large ensemble cast, more of a complicated comedy that dealt with social issues, all the way up through Seinfeld, which was quite famously a very complex show, including one episode where all of the scenes were shown in reverse order, and you actually had to watch it very carefully to even understand what was going on. In other areas, TV crime dramas, we went from Dragnet, which was a very simple cops and robbers, the FBI is trying to find the bank robber. Later on, Hill Street Blues, again, a large ensemble cast, to finally The Sopranos, which had an enormous cast, many, many different storylines, many different intertwined plot lines, and in fact, a kind of interesting moral ambiguity that you would have never seen in an earlier program. In The Sopranos, you often find yourself rooting for Tony because he's a really lovable guy and a mass murderer, but, details. And you would have never seen that kind of thing in the older shows, a very simple moral outlook and a very simple kind of view. I don't even need to talk about computer gaming, how much more complicated things have gotten here. Pong was a really great game, not much of a plot. Very basic. Later on, we had things like Doom and Quake, where you're fighting monsters, and the games have gotten more complicated. And then today we have World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft has over 11 million people playing online. And what's interesting about Warcraft is that it is an incredibly social game. So the real point of Warcraft is not fighting monsters and so forth. It's about a community of people who get together and do things together. They form guilds and they go out on missions, and it's really all about that social structure. And so it's significantly more subtle, complex, ethical, moral, all kinds of interesting things come into play. So as a result, what we're seeing is that some of the ways that we learn about culture and the ways we interact with culture have changed. So no longer do we simply just open up the TV guide to find out what time I Love Lucy is coming on. Now, for a show like Lost, we have something called Lostpedia. So how many people here know the show Lost? Okay, so good. Everybody, basically. And so, as you know, Lost is probably one of the most complicated TV shows ever made. It has dozens and dozens of characters, very complicated storyline. Many things are mysteries and hidden. And at Wikia, which is my for-profit company, we have a site called Lostpedia. And this is just to illustrate the way people are interacting with the culture. So Lostpedia is the ultimate encyclopedia of Lost. And so it's a place where the super fans, the people who are absolutely fanatical about Lost, can go and write about the show. So 5 years ago, what they would have done, they would have all gotten together on a message board and they would have talked to each other. These early adopter, very key influencer people, they would talk to each other on message boards, and often in a jargon or language that only they would understand after some time. Whereas today what they're doing is they're coming together and they're creating a resource that's available and accessible to ordinary fans. And they're very aware that they're writing for people who are fans but don't know as much as they do. And so they're really there to share knowledge. This community has, in the past few years, they've written 5,794 articles about Lost. So I want you to think for a moment about what this means and the depth of this content. I'm not talking about 5,794 message board posts or comments. That would number into the thousands or probably millions by now. These are individually written articles, much like a Wikipedia entry, about every possible aspect of the show. So if, for example, in Lost, if you see a character reading a particular book, you can be assured that in Lostpedia there will be an entry about that book, which will explain how that book ties to that character and to the broader plot. And they're trying to figure out the show, and it's very, very complicated. What's interesting about this, for me, is that this is not a one-way process. The complexity of Lost is made possible in part by Lostpedia and by the internet community. The J.J. Abrams, who's the creator of the show, is a huge fan of Lostpedia, and they actually use it to make sure that everything that they're doing is within canon. They know that the fans know what they've done in the past better than they know, even. And so they're able to create a much more rich, compelling, complicated TV experience in which the entire universe that they're working in can be kept more or less consistent with multiple timelines, all kinds of crazy stuff they've done in the show. And this is something that would have not been possible before. So how did we get here? And so, you know, how do we get to the point that we have a Lostpedia with almost 6,000 articles? So Wikipedia was the great experiment. Wikipedia started in 2001. And Wikipedia started with a very radical idea. Charles Van Doren, who was later a senior editor at Britannica, said, the ideal encyclopedia should be radical. It should stop being safe. But if you know the history of Britannica since 1962, it's been anything but radical. Britannica is still a very safe, old-fashioned encyclopedia project. Wikipedia, on the other hand, began with a very radical idea, and that's for all of us to imagine a world in which every single person on the planet is given free access to the sum of all human knowledge. That's what we're doing. So every piece of this vision statement has a critical meaning and is very important. And I'll go through some of these details so that you understand it. So first of all, what is Wikipedia? So I used to always ask, how many people here have used Wikipedia? Which is everybody. So now, since that's not a very interesting question anymore, the real question is, how many people here have actually edited Wikipedia? So a handful, not that many. I just was recently speaking at a high school in London, and I got about 60% of the kids in the school raised their hand that they had edited Wikipedia at some point, which I thought was very interesting. So for people who've simply used Wikipedia, if you've just come to Wikipedia, you typed into a search engine something you were interested in, and you came to Wikipedia, people usually, they have some idea of how it works, but they don't really know some of the ideas behind Wikipedia. So I want to go through some of that very quickly. So I always talk about free access to the sum of all human knowledge. Wikipedia is a freely licensed encyclopedia. So what do I mean by freely licensed? I mean free in the sense of open source software, or free software, if you're familiar with those concepts. The idea here is that for Wikipedia, and for all of the work in Wikipedia, including all of our software, you have the freedom to copy it, you can modify it, you can redistribute it, you can redistribute modified versions, and you can do all of these things commercially or non-commercially. So when people put things into Wikipedia, they aren't just contributing to this one humanitarian project. They're contributing to a storehouse of knowledge which can then be repurposed and reused by anybody for anything. And this empowers an amazing amount of energy within our community, and it empowers all kinds of interesting projects all around the world as people are taking Wikipedia content and repurposing it for educational purposes, entertainment purposes. They can do anything that they want with it and don't even have to ask us permission. What is the sum of all human knowledge? When we talk about Wikipedia, we talk about what it is. There's a famous page amongst Wikipedians in Wikipedia called What Wikipedia Is Not. One of the most important things about Wikipedia is that it is an encyclopedia. It's not a library, not an archive, not a textbook. We're not YouTube, so we don't have funny cat videos. I love funny cat videos, but they don't belong in Wikipedia. In fact, there are lots and lots of things that don't belong in Wikipedia, and that focus on the concept of an encyclopedia is part of what has allowed our community to be successful. They have a very clear idea of what it is they're trying to accomplish, and they stick very, very strongly to that original goal of creating an encyclopedia. So how global is Wikipedia? We have this grand ambition to be in all the languages of the world. We want a free encyclopedia for everyone, and we're succeeding in that to some extent. It's an interesting thing to look at. So we now have over 3 million articles in English, which is the largest project. But we also have over 500,000 in German, French, Polish, Japanese, Italian, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese. As you can see, we're very strong in all of the European languages. The Germans actually have over 1 million entries now. And so we're very strong in the European languages, including the Northern European languages. We're strong in Japanese, and we're strong in Chinese. We have over 300,000 entries in Chinese. So this is an interesting one, and I'm going to talk more about China later because I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact of these new technologies on democracy and freedom of speech and how we are basically approaching that whole set of issues. So the Chinese Wikipedia, just keep in mind, it's quite large, over 300,000 entries, even though we were completely banned in China for 3 years. But we'll come back to that. So how popular is Wikipedia? Well, we're the 6th most popular in Germany, 7th most popular in the US, 9th most popular in India, 10th most popular in Japan, and yet we're only the 62nd most popular in China. Again, this is a direct result of having been banned in China for 3 years straight. So we really got behind in China. Also, Baidu copies all of our content and publishes under basically Baidupedia. It says all rights reserved Baidu at the bottom, which is interesting, but this is China. So anyway, we are very global, but once we get outside of the major languages that I've mentioned, things are much smaller. We have languages, all the languages of India, we have projects started, but the largest one we have is around 50, 60,000 articles. In Africa, we only have 3 languages of note in Africa. We have Kiswahili, we have Afrikaans, which is actually Old Dutch, it's a colonial language, and we have now Wolof is our 3rd language. It's the language of Senegal, which now has over 1,000 entries. All of the other languages of Africa have less than 1,000 entries. So although we have a very broad vision of where we want to get, we're a long way from getting there, particularly in the developing world, and that's becoming more of a focus for us.